Welcome, everyone. Glad to be here with you guys. Today's portion of this seminar is on the quality management systems, the process approach, and some of the regulatory changes that have been occurring in the industry that have impacted your quality management system, and why it's important to understand what these changes are doing. Again, my name is Rick, and welcome. Today's webinar objectives will be the following. It's a high-level, fundamental understanding of the quality management system, and in particular, the purpose of the quality management system, its design intent. In addition, we like to make sure we recognize that the quality management system is a system of processes. That'll be a big impact going forward from an auditing perspective, in terms of the auditing, going from an element-based audit to a process approach audit. And then there are changes that are occurring in the regulatory landscape impacting the QMS. And I'd like to address some of those changes and what it means to you who are within your own quality management system. So there are some acronyms that we must come to terms with. Acronyms are one of the favorite things that happens in the industry. Here are just several acronyms. QMS stands for Quality Management System. ISO stands for International Standards Organization. SOP stands for Standard Operating Procedures. And then we get to some of the regulatory stuff. QMSR, new one, Quality Management System Regulation. This is replacing 21 CFR 820, the QSR, Quality System Regulation. And we're in a transitional phase right now, so the QMSR. MDSAP, Medical Device Single Audit Program, has been on for a while now, several years. And then EUMDR, European Medical Device Regulation, is also a new one. It's been around for maybe 3 or 4 years now. But the last three are regulatory in nature, and they impact your quality management system. And you have to, depending on what market you're serving, you have to make sure you meet those requirements. We'll be discussing this as we go through the presentation. So let's look at the big picture, the quality management system. If you're a medical device manufacturer, you have to have a quality management system. If you're selling to the US, that would be the old 21 CFR 20 or the new QMSR. If you're selling to Canada, it's MDSAP. So what I want to leave the thought here is that each country has its own requirements for the quality management system. The interesting part is that at the highest level, the country level, they're trying to harmonize the requirements so we don't have a bunch of 160 quality management systems. We have a quality management system that meets all the requirements. And so that's important that we recognize that. The other part is that we recognize that there is a system of processes or subsystems that need to be looked at. And this particular picture looks at it from a product development roadmap. We start off here on the left from concept and go through the design phase of design control, if you will. And then we transfer it to production or manufacturing. We have a regulatory submission that needs to be done. And then we're commercializing it. And then we have to keep an eye on afterwards, post-market. The interesting part is these hexagons here are really indicating some major processes that have to be looked at. The whole thing is covered by risk management. Risk management goes from one end of this product development roadmap across the whole thing. And when we talk about risk management, we're talking about risk management ISO 14971 for product risk, if you will. So we look at some of these hexagons. You got design development, document control. There's a requirement in ISO 1345. It's in 7.3. Risk management, you have prior approvals, and you have this post-market, commercialization post-market. Clearly, you have CAPA, you have complaint handling, you have adverse event, serious incident reporting, all the things that we have to report to the markets that we're serving. So this is just high-level view of the product development roadmap that one must be aware of and how it's connected and how they communicate with what's going on across the quality management system. So there's some fundamental questions that we should be able to answer or at least ask and have some answers to it. Why do we need a quality management system? What is a quality management system? What is the purpose of the quality management system? What's the output of a quality management system? Who's responsible for the health of your quality management system? Where does it start? Where does the quality management system start and where does it begin? Start, begin, and stop. And how does it work? So we're going to try to answer some of these questions as we go along, but just think about it. From a person in this world, and I'm answering the first one, why do we need a quality management system? Look, if you get sick or a loved one gets sick and you go to the hospital and they're going to be using a bunch of instrumentation, machines, giving you injections, whatever it is you're going to do in a hospital situation, clearly you want those things to be safe and you want them to be effective. You don't want something to just come off the street and they use it on you, right? So the quality management system, its primary purpose is to ensure that medical devices are safe for intended use and are effective. And we as consumers expect that. And so we need something to allow us to address that. And how they address it is through a quality management system. It's a system of processes, and there are regulations or requirements. By the way, when we say regulation, those are laws we have to worry about. And there are laws and requirements that we have to meet. Interesting enough, we want to talk a little bit about what is a quality management system, and there's definitions to that. Here's a definition for ISO 9000:2015, which is a dictionary for quality management system or quality in general. And it defines this as the following. Quality management system comprises activities by which the organization identifies its objectives, determines the processes and resources required to achieve desired results. In other words, for desired results, design intent. So this is the definition of a quality management system. In plain old English, it is the quality management system is a system of interdependent processes that are linked together and support each other to achieve design intent or the purpose of the quality management system. And so interdependent processes that are connected together and support each other to achieve the desired intent. By the way, the purpose of the quality management system is the design intent. So just be aware of that. So let's look at it from a purpose versus output of the quality management system. And yeah, sometimes it can be a roller coaster ride as we navigate through some of these requirements, but we need to understand the fundamentals. There's a difference between purpose, which is a design intent, versus the output of the quality management system. So per ISO 1345, the standard we use for medical devices, in the scope of the standard, it says the following. This international standard specifies requirements for a quality management system where an organization needs to demonstrate its ability to provide medical devices and related services that consistently meet customer and applicable regulatory requirements. I bolded that. So consistently, the technical definition of consistently is repeat and reproduce the build of the product. So we build one product, the next product will be the same, okay? And you have to meet customer and applicable regulatory requirements. Not all the regulatory requirements may be applicable to your medical device. So as an organization, you have to determine which are applicable. If we continue trying to get the purpose, let's look at what 21 CFR 820 said, okay? In its scope, at the very beginning of this regulation, the requirements in this part are intended to ensure that finished devices were safe and effective and otherwise compliant with the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Ensure, that means to make certain that the finished devices will be safe for intended use and have effective performance. Going back, as a consumer, as a patient, going to the doctor or hospital, I want to be assured or have a sense of confidence that the devices that are going to be used to help me get well are safe for intended use and are effective. Now, if we combine these bolded words that I had bolded, I combined 1345 and 21 CFR design intent requirements from both the scopes, then we get this list of terms that the bolded parts are coming from those two scopes. It says we must ensure, your organization must ensure that it means that you can consistently build product or repeat and reproduce the production of medical devices such that they are safe for intended use and the medical device has effective performance, meets its design intent, and meet customer requirements and meets applicable regulatory requirements, no matter the scale or volume and locations the QMS governs. You can be building one or you can be building 10,000. The QMS must ensure, make certain that you can consistently build a product that is safe for intended use, have effective performance, and meets all the requirements, both customer and applicable regulatory requirements. So this is the purpose. This is the design intent. Now, the interesting part here is the fact that this is given. Your organization doesn't have to come up with this design intent or purpose. It is given in the regulations. So what does that mean? Globally, every quality management system that uses 1345 and 21 CFR 820 has the same purpose. If you're Johnson & Johnson, if you're Stryker, if you're Medtronic, it doesn't matter what company you are, the quality management system has the same purpose. Why are you getting it from the regulation and from the standard? That's something that's given. So every quality management system for every organization in this symposium has the same purpose, and it's important to recognize. Now, that's the purpose, design intent. So what is the output of the quality management system? Well, the output of the quality management system is all the technical documentation, quote, evidence that provides objective evidence that the QMS has met its purpose or design intent. It's all the technical documentation. It's a technical file or the technical documentation file, right? So that means it's your quality policy, it's your quality manual, it's all your training records, it's all your CAPA files, all your audits, all your production stuff. It's everything. This stack of documents have to demonstrate that it meets the purpose or design intent of the quality management system. And by the way, organizations get audited to that technical documentation to ensure that your quality management system is indeed meeting its design intent. Before we go on to the next slide, I just want to make sure you understand that purpose is design intent, that the purpose of quality management system is your design intent. As a matter of fact, if you go to your standard operating procedure, your SOP, you're going to have a purpose in that SOP. That purpose is really talking about the design intent of whatever that procedure is about. So the procedure says CAPA. Its purpose is the CAPA was designed to do, this CAPA process was designed to do, that's the purpose of that. And so just be aware of that. As an auditor, we're going to be looking at that very closely. So the quality management system is a system of process that works together. They're interdependent. They're like gears, and they support each other. And they got to be set up in a way that makes sense for your organization. So at a very high level, the QMS system of processes, there are three pieces or three parts to the quality management system. There are the pre-market requirements, that is getting permission to sell a product in a given country. And we'll have a list of what those processes look like. Then there is the product realization or manufacturing or operations. We're building the product. And then we sell the product. We have the post-market requirements that we have to keep an eye on the product, making sure that it's still safe for intended use and has effective performance. So the quality management system governs these three major areas: pre-market requirements, product realization, and post-market requirements. And we're going to find out as we move down this line in a few slides down the road that the scope of the quality management system changed. And it started changing with MDSAP, Medical Device Single Audit Program requirements, and the UMDR. And what really changed was it impacted this whole circle, but the pre-market requirements where most of the new stuff came in. In other words, the quality management system now governs the pre-market requirements. In the past, that was not really the case. So we'll be covering that here in a little bit. So here's some examples of the pre-market processes. Pre-market processes is really getting permission or preparing to get permission to market a device in a given country. So that encompasses that we should have a regulatory strategy. So we'll be looking for a regulatory strategy. It's a process. How we're going to get device X into country Y. What is it going to take? What's our strategy? Where do we have to go first? All those things have to be documented in your regulatory strategy. Interesting enough, this is a requirement coming from the UMDR. We should always have it, but they very specifically require that you have a regulatory strategy. Secondly, we have to then, if you will, the medical device industry has its own safety requirements and safety and performance requirements. And they used to be called essential principles and requirements. It's now called, because of UMDR, general safety performance requirements, the GSPR. In that regulation, you can find these requirements in Annex 1. So we have these requirements that are coming from the industry and from the regulatory side of the house that says at minimum, you have to meet these requirements. So as an organization, you have to find out what those requirements are, and it's going to be in a table format. And you're going to have to tell us, yes, that's a requirement, no, and justify why that's not a requirement in that table format. And so these are going to be really important. So be aware of that as you move forward. The other part is standards. There are a lot of standards. The ISO standards organization, that's all they do. They create standards. So there are many standards that you have to be aware of. And sometimes the standards are device specific or help devices, if you will. And for connected devices, there's going to be a whole list of standards that you have to worry about. If you're new to connected devices, then it's a big learning curve to get up this hill in terms of getting the connected devices where they need to be in terms of the standards. In other words, meeting the requirements of the standards. And so standards are going to be really important. And the more important thing is, and a lot of people get caught in audits, is because they're not controlling the standards, the rev control standards, or they're not depicting, yeah, we want to do the standard, and the standard could be 500 pages, if you will. I'm exaggerating. There are standards, by the way, that way. But you're only looking at page X. You have to tell us that because you're not encompassing the whole standard. So be aware of that. Standards are important. And then part of the conceptual stuff is that you have to come up with device specifications. Device specifications is, from a perspective, is what's its intended purpose, what's its intended use, indications for use, what's its biocompatibilities, is there clinical stuff? All that has to be addressed as an input going into design planning. And then you have design verification and validation. The reality is design control is a bridge, if you will. It's a connector bridge between pre-market requirements and production requirements or production. Clinical evaluation, this is huge. And sometimes we think that all devices require a clinical investigation or clinical trial. That's not the case. Not all devices require a clinical investigation and clinical trial, which can be very time-consuming and expensive, but all devices require a clinical evaluation. And importantly enough, that this clinical evaluation has to be updated as your product matures through its product life cycle. So you could have clinical evaluation Rev A, then B, then C, then D as you progress, and you tend to tell us standardize how often you're going to evaluate that. Clearly, you want to put a standardized maybe in a 2-year cycle unless something happens in the market, okay? And then you're going to have this declaration of conformity. And so what you're declaring here is really important. And the declaration of conformity is you're declaring that you meet the regulations, the applicable regulations. But more importantly, this is a piece of paper that you guys, or a statement you guys or organizations are going to create. Technically speaking, that declaration of conformity is, yeah, you meet the applicable requirements, but you have sufficient clinical evidence to meet the general safety performance requirements that you check that, yeah, you have to meet those. So declaration of conformity is regulatory, saying, yeah, we're meeting the applicable regulatory requirements, and we have sufficient clinical evidence through a clinical evaluation that we meet the general safety performance requirements, the GSPR, which, by the way, is part of the GSPR is part of the risk management. So risk management is involved here. This is all stuff that's being discussed, if you will, in the pre-market requirements in the prior slide. And this slice of the pie, if you will, tended to increase the scope of your quality management system, which means it's brand new, which means then clearly folks need to be trained on that, and your internal audit program has to be upgraded to be able to meet those requirements. Let's go to the next piece, product realization process, example of processes. This is from the quality management system perspective. There's a bridge between pre-market and product or operations or manufacturing. That bridge tends to be design control. Some of the processes that you will see in product realization, again, this is from the quality management system. Clearly, you have a ton of procedures and work instructions and forms and templates for building the product, okay? The quality management system doesn't create that, it governs that. So here's some things that we're gonna be looking at. We're gonna have to have a process for management controls. Production and process controls. This is where all your work instructions and templates and procedures to build the product, this is where we're controlling it. Yes, we have to have corrective action, preventive action. All your documentation has to be controlled. All your records have to be controlled. If it's not controlled, then it's not going to work. So if your documentation is not controlled, here's an example. Your documentation is not controlled. FDA comes in and does an audit and finds out that you don't have control of your documents or records. Then they're going to say, and you could have great product. It's passing all your tests and you can have great product. The FDA will issue you a 483 or warning letter that says something to the effect that your product is adulterated. Failure, your product is adulterated because your doc control system is out of control. So just be aware, it's really important. You have to have validations, including software. And so for connected devices, this is going to be really important, the software validations. Now, connected devices have been around for a while, but in reality, in the scheme of things, it's relatively new. And so from the connected devices, from a watch to a ring to whatever it is that you're manufacturing, you're producing out there, the software is going to be a big issue, and how we validate it, because software is going to be a high risk. It's going to pop up in risk management, as a risk management, cybersecurity, all that kind of stuff is going. So I would add to this, for those of you doing connected devices, software validation is going to be really important. Training, when we think about training, a lot of times we think about training the operators to do work instructions, or the people working on the production floor. The big hole is training, the engineering training that's required to run some of these systems. Just because you're an engineer and you've been trained, you could be a highly effective engineer, but most engineering schools don't train you on the quality management system. And there are big gaps there. For example, the concept of clinical evaluation and how that's done, that's an art in itself, art and science in itself. The area of measurements and calibration, that's specific. So the hole that you have is in training, typically is not in the production world, it's in the engineering world. So just be aware of that. You also have to control your supplier chain management. There's going to be a presentation given to that later on in the seminar or the symposium, supplier chain management. There's purchasing and there is labeling. I want to say one thing about labeling that's important to recognize conceptually. When you slap a label on your device, that label has a lot of information, including the UDI, unique device identification string. That label is your last control of your device as you ship it out. And to get it back to its home base, if something goes wrong, you need that label. So that label is an extension of your quality management system to the public. And that label has to be correct because it's going to bring you back home if something goes wrong. And so labeling becomes a really important area that we have to work at. So we've covered pre-market, product realization. Now we're going to sell the product and put it out in the market. And this is post-market. From a EUMDR perspective, post-market surveillance is on steroids. They really ramped it up, and so we have to pay attention to that and what the different reports that they're going to want to be done. So we got post-market surveillance, which means keeping an eye on the product, ensuring that your product is still safe for intended use and has effective performance. You're going to have a post-market surveillance system. Within that, you're going to have a post-market surveillance plan development, reporting. The inputs to that is complaint management, complaint system, complaint process. I think it's a misnomer to call it a complaint sometimes. The reality is the complaint can be either good or bad, and complaint should be more of, I take it to be more of clinical experience using the device, whether it's good or bad. It's clinical experience that we're going to use to ensure that the device is safe for intended use and has effective performance. Part of the complaint management system, if you do get some sort of complaint and somebody's been hurt or there's been an adverse event, there are very strict rules by country what you need to do. And there's time limits that you have to do that. So, and there's reporting. Clearly, when you get to this adverse event and serious reporting, your company is in a legal liability situation. So it's almost like all hands on deck, and you're going to want to make sure all your documentation is correct. You want to be able to pull that product back. That's why the labeling is really important. And so be aware of that. This adverse event, serious incident reporting, can put your organization in a legal liability situation. And oh, by the way, they don't have to report it to you. They can report it to the regulatory folks, like in the US, the FDA. Obviously, you're going to have corrective action, preventive action. One thing that's kind of interesting from the FDA perspective, they issue out a report on an annual basis, and they say that CAPA and production and process controls are the top two that organizations that don't know how to work them yet. There's a lot of issues. In other words, CAPA and product and process controls, they swap 1 and 2 on the top list, are saying, look, after all these years, organizations are still having difficulties implementing CAPA and production and process controls correctly. And so when auditors come in, and especially the FDA comes in, or a competent authority comes in from the European Union or Anvisa from Brazil or Health Canada, they're always going to look at CAPA. They're always going to look at CAPA. So CAPA has this big bullseye on it. And so just be aware of that. We're also looking at the post-market surveillance links up to risk management file updates and clinical evaluation updates. So in my mind, the way I think about it, when I'm talking post-market surveillance, I'm saying I have triplets here. Post-market surveillance, risk management, and clinical are all linked together and they support each other. And so when something goes wrong in one of those, then it's going to impact the other two. So when I look at clinical, I have to pay attention to risk and post-market and vice versa, depending your entry point from an audit. All this is being done, and there's going to be some math involved. So then the math is going to be really important. You should have a procedure for data analysis. Most importantly, though, you should have somebody on the team, whether it be post-market or risk management or clinical person or team of people, that's what they do. They're the experts in this math. Just because I'm an engineer and I went through a bunch of math courses doesn't make me the expert. That's not what I do a day to day. And so we're looking to make sure that there are people, we meaning the auditors, and I am an auditor, are looking for people that have the right competencies and statistical tools, if you will, to do this. In connected devices, not only are we looking for that, but we're also looking for expertise in software and make sure you have the right competencies in that. So then we went from, we just covered these three areas: pre-market requirements, product realization, and post-market. Listed some of the process. Transparency, not all the processes were included in those three slides, just a feel and a taste of some of the critical ones that you should be aware of. And so the quality management system governs these three areas: pre-market, product, and post-market requirements. In addition to that, you should be aware, and we talked about it earlier in one of the slides in pre-market, that you should have standards are going to be important. And here's a short list of standards that you would have to have from a connected device that could be used for your device. Some may apply, some may not apply. This is not an all-inclusive list, but this is some of the things that we're going to be looking at. And so you have to have folks, first of all, you have to have access to these. Some of them cost money. Secondly, you have to have expertise in this, and you have to control this, and you have to put those requirements have to be placed in the design planning to make sure that the right requirements were used. So I can't overemphasize, one of the gotchas from an audit perspective is this concept of standards and which standards are going to be used. Again, this is not an all-inclusive list, but this is part of the list that you should be aware of. So let's talk a little bit about the process approach to the quality management system. This is coming from the ISO standard, particular 1345-2016 in clause 0.3. This became really evident when MDSAP came into being, MDSAP Medical Device Single Audit Program, which we'll have slides here in a minute. There's 5 countries involved in that. And what really changed in the program is they went from an element-based meaning clause 4.1, 4.2 in the standards, in ISO standards, to a process-based. They're looking at it more from a systems and process perspective. So to function effectively, organizations must identify and manage numerous linked processes. Well, what processes? Well, here's processes in pre-market and production and post-market in those areas, and they're not all inclusive. We have to identify and manage the numerous linked, connected processes. Now, the processes are connected through the inputs and outputs of the process. So we have inputs and outputs. This is how they're connected. The process approach is a systematic management of the processes and their interactions to achieve intended results. Intended results means design intent, which means purpose of that process. So here's some definitions. This is from 9001-2015, the general standard for quality management systems, and then ISO 1345 specifically for medical devices. This standard, 1345, says the process approach is the application of a system of processes. So the process approach in this standard, 1345, it says that the process approach is the application of a system of processes. So there's more than one process. There's a system of processes, identifying their interactions and managing them to produce a desired outcome, or desired outcome again means design intent. So going into it, we look at the quality management system, and it says system in there. We have to take the systems approach, which then one level down is the process approach, right? We're breaking it up, will be the process approach. And so we're looking to make sure that the processes are connected correctly and that they're talking correctly and they are interdependent. So let's look at some changes to the regulatory landscape. And there has been some interesting changes that occur. Sometimes I've been in this business for a long time, and sometimes there's nothing happening, and all of a sudden the dam breaks and everything's happening. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, the regulatory landscape, looking at the world from a regulatory perspective, and this is regulatory from a medical device perspective. So here are some things that we have to pay attention to. First of all, we have ISO 1345-2016. 2016 was a long time ago, but my understanding the standards was going to get revised shortly. They're in that process. Then we have the FDA Quality Management System Regulation, which is QMSR. This is the FDA transitioning from 21 CFR 820 to 1345. Then you have MDSAP, Medical Device Single Audit Program, and you have EU MDR. These are some of the big ones that have changed. So let's look at some of the impacts that some of this stuff had on your quality management system. So we're going to look at changes to the regulatory landscape from an MDSAP, EU MDR, QMSR perspective. MDSAP, 5 countries banded together and created this program called Medical Device Single Audit Program. The countries are Australia, Brazil, Canada, Japan, and the great USA. So in a nutshell, the question is why? Well, the dilemma was, or the idea or thought process was the following. Every country, let's say that you as an organization are selling to each of these countries. What that means to you from an audit perspective, each of these countries will eventually come to your door and knock on your door. Some announced, some unannounced, that says we need to do an audit on the TGA stuff from Australia, requirements from Australia, or Brazil, or Canada, or Japan, or US. They'll be coming to your country and an audit. So that means as an organization, you might be getting on an annual or semi-annual basis, not semi-annual, biannual basis, an audit from each of these 5 countries. Interesting enough, because of the sheer number of medical device manufacturers, these countries may not have the bandwidth to audit every medical device manufacturer that is in their market. So they said Australia and Brazil, Canada, and Japan, this is paraphrasing, I was not there, but I'm just saying based on the conversations that I've had and reading stuff, basically said, hey, look, guys, this is paraphrasing again, we all audit to the same stuff, kind of the same stuff. And most of the organizations, meaning medical device manufacturing, are using 1345, ISO 1345 as a standard. And we have agreed to that. Why can't we have one audit that satisfies our requirements? And they agreed to it, and they called it the Medical Device Single Audit Program, MDSAP. Kind of the way it went. Obviously, it was more political, more rigorous, but in general, that's high level what happened. So they created this MDSAP, and there's requirements for it, and they used as its base 13485. So what happened is then they still hadn't solved the problem of bandwidth. They don't have enough auditors. So they created a process to have organizations apply and go through a very rigorous process to become an auditing organization for the MDSAP program that satisfied these 5 countries' requirements. And so organizations went through this really rigorous process and became what they call auditing organizations. And when they come to audit you, it's a regulatory audit, and they're wearing the hat of MDSAP. That hat has the 5 flags. So we now have auditing organizations which are commercial, which the organization getting audited has to pay for, and it's part of the MDSAP program. Really cool program. These are the 5 countries that started it. So again, the MDSAP incorporates the requirements of ISO 1345. In addition to, they include country-specific requirements. In other words, they went and looked at the countries, the 5 countries looked at the requirements, each individually, and said, yeah, that meets our requirement from a regulatory perspective. Or they said, no, that's not quite what we wanted. So they added that requirement or readjusted the requirement as a country-specific requirement in the MDSAP documentation. So you have to pay really close attention to those country-specific requirements, because for some reason, they did the audit, meaning the countries did the audit and says, this requirement isn't strong enough. So they added their own spin to it and under country-specific requirements. So here are the 5 countries, and here are the regulations that you have to worry about. So one of the things that is interesting is to get participation in this program. And initially the countries weren't getting the right participation or enough participation. So our good friends or cousins in the North, Canada, decided, cousins from the US, if you will, to Canada, decided to say, you know what? We're doing away with our stuff and we're using MDSAP specifically. So if you want to sell to Canada, you have to be MDSAP certified. Okay. So just be aware of that. What was the impact to your quality management system because of MDSAP? Here's some ideas. And the QMS scope was enlarged to include pre-market requirements, device marketing authorization facility registration, clinical evaluation, essential principles or the GSPR, and additional country-specific requirements. The device marketing authorization facility registration regulatory stuff was not part of the quality management system before, and now it is. That includes adverse reporting and stuff. Clinical evaluation is part of now the quality management system. General safety performance requirements or essential principles are now part of the quality management system. So if you weren't doing this before, you now have to put it into your quality management system. You have to document it. You have to train on it. Your internal audit program has to be adjusted and make sure the auditors know how to audit that stuff. And it's now being done on a process approach. So that's important to recognize. From an auditing perspective, the auditing techniques change from an element-based to a process approach technique. And the best way I can illustrate this is the following. Prior to MDSAP, we had, let's just take the quality management system and let's just take a requirement. Let's take requirement that says in clause 4.2 says, 4.24 says you shall have a procedure to document control. Well, as an auditor, we would go in there, we have a procedure. And yes, check. And then we say, does it meet all the requirements, the A through G in the standard, whatever the requirements are? Check, 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 yes, and we're out. In the process approach says, yeah, we look at that and say, wait a minute, is this also working? Has it been implemented correctly? Does it have the right inputs and outputs? All that is being looked at from a process approach. So they take the element base and then just put on top of that the process approach. So that's a big change from auditing. External and internal audits require additional training, process approach auditing, regulatory processes, clinical evaluation processes, and any of the additional country-specific requirements. Let's move on to EUMDR. This is a big change. This is a monstrous change, if you will. But look, prior to that, so EUMDR, here's the EUMDR flag. So why the change? Well, we went from MDD to MDR. Look, only one letter change, the D to an R, and it's causing a huge concern across everybody trying to market to the European Union. One letter change, medical device directive to medical device regulation, a D to an R, and it's causing a lot of heartburn and a lot of changes. So let's look at what that means. So the change drivers to EUMDR were three buckets or three areas that changed. First of all, there were some safety scandals in the EU. You probably heard of this, the breast implants and the hip implants. People went to jail because of this. And in reality, both of them had to do with supplier controls. It's interesting. Or bad decisions on the organization and supplier controls. Issues in the regulatory environment. There was a presumption made that, let me rephrase this. We're going to see it in a slide coming up, but the issues in regulatory was that the MDD, medical device directives, every country in the EU could interpret that differently because it was a directive. And so not every country implemented it the same way. So as you go from one country to another country in the EU, things are different. And that caused a lot of issues from a regulatory perspective. And then lastly, that there was this, because of this middle issue, there was this global harmonization efforts across the world from a regulatory perspective to having a set of requirements that make sense for everybody. In addition, there has been significant innovations in technology, connected devices, science, and business outsourcing requiring more prescriptive regulatory framework. Now, here's the concept that sometimes we miss. Quality is a technology, and over time it matures and we get better at it, and we have changes. That's why the standards change from quality. That's why the regulatory, because as we get better at something and we introduce new stuff, we need to get better. And so things change. This is what this block means, significant innovations. Force quality to change. So we had three change drivers: safety issues in not everybody implemented it the same way, and the global harmonization. So here are the drivers. Remember that the European Union regulators decided that ISO 1345, which is the international standard for medical devices, alone could not ensure a presumption of conformity. Said, you know what? Because of the safety scandals that we're having and what's going on, ISO 1345 is not strong enough. And so we can't have this make certain a presumption of conformity just using 1345. In addition, the implementation of appropriate quality management system requirements was lacking in the directives, in the MDD directives or IVD directives. And regulators wanted more prescriptive requirements than those stated in the ISO standard. So they created Z annexes to help us with that. So there's this whole drivers that's driving why the changes to the UMDR. What really happened was we had these green directives. They went from 3 to 2. We have a medical device regulation, and now we have an in vitro diagnostic regulation in the EU. And we're still in transition. We've been in transition for a while now. and it's caused a lot of issues, and we're still not finished, and they've added time for transition. There's a whole script to that, but just be aware that we're still in the transition phase. So remember the slide that said why MDD to R? And I said, well, the only thing that changed was a letter from a D to an R. Well, the reason is the following. The D, directives, harmonize the regulation scheme. Countries transpose directives into their own laws, but not in a one-to-one manner. So they could do whatever they wanted. As a regulation, it applies as is. You can't change it. So all the EU countries have to apply the EU MDR the same way. It's no longer directed. That's why it's a regulation. It's law. And so that's what changed. And the third way was decisions applied to specific countries to correct an issue or provide resolution. But I'm more focused on directives to regulation. It went from a directive, you could implement it however you felt fit for your particular country. As a MDR, you have to implement as is. So that becomes an interesting thing. So what did the general impact from EU to your QMS system is, from EU to EU? What was the general impact from the EU MDR requirements to your quality management system? And here are the areas where it got impacted. All these were impacted. Some, for lack of terms or words, man, they're on steroids, and we have to pay attention to them. This one, unique device identification, in the US, that's not an issue because we were way ahead of the game. We had implemented unique device identification, UDIs, a long time ago. So you're a US company, that's not a big deal. But you're from Europe, that is a big deal. If you're a European company, you haven't implemented it. I want to look at the big three. Post-market surveillance has a bunch of new reports that have to be addressed. They are PMSR, post-market surveillance requirements, PSUR, product safety update report, post-market clinical follow-up. You have clinical evaluations you have to do. Here's the deal, presumption of conformity. ISO 1345-2016, as it now stands, when you do a PDF search, or you're in PDF, or you search the document and you put clinical shows up one time in the requirements. That's under design. One time, the word clinical. In the UEMDR requirements, it has multiple articles and 2 annexes. It is on steroids. You really have to pay attention to the clinical evaluation. Clinical evaluation is a triplet to post-market and risk management. Risk management and clinical general safety performance requirements are tied together, but there's a whole annex on Annex 1 of the UMDR on general safety performance requirements you have to pay attention to. Risk management is all over the place in the UMDR. So just be aware. Clearly, the technical documentation is the output of the quality management system that says that that provides objective evidence that the purpose of the quality management system or design intent is being met. And practically, the design intent is that the device is safe for intended use and has effective performance, and we meet all applicable regulatory requirements. This is what this technical documentation is about. You will get audited. Your technical documentation will get audited. So just be aware of that. So these are some of the buckets or the areas or processes that got really impacted in the quality management system and that you must be paying attention to. Auditing, auditors have to be trained. Interesting enough, not only internal auditors, but the auditing organization, the notified bodies auditors, external auditors have to be trained in both regulatory strategy, clinical evaluation, post-market. There's a lot of training going on because these are very specific and they have a lot of requirements. So auditing got impacted. Transition to another requirement, QMSR, transitioning from 21 CFR 20 to the QMSR. The folks that got impacted in this will get impacted in this are folks that only in the US that only had implemented 21 CFR 20 and not paid attention to ISO 1345. Organizations that sell outside the United States, sell to other countries, are probably using 1345. And so that the change itself is not going to be specific, have a lot of impact to those who already have a 1345 compliant system. It's those folks that don't, who have a 21 CFR 20, typically had to be to small to mid-sized business in the US that could get impacted because they're not familiar with the 1345 standard requirements. There are differences that exist between 1345 and 21 CFR 20, and the differences is in the language. For example, just give me one difference, just so you know. In 21 CFR 20, there is no requirement to have a quality manual. In 1345, there is a requirement. However, it's interesting enough. If the FDA shows up at your door, they want to see a quality manual. There's an expectation. So, but those kind of terms stuff we have to pay attention to. Organizations that only implement their QMS 220 CFR 20 will be impacted more. This tend to be only small or mid-sized companies that sell the U.S. Larger companies that sell to just on the U.S. will get impacted also, but typically larger companies are global in nature. There are those that aren't. I understand that. Organizations that have implemented the QMS to both the ISO 1345 and 21 CFR 20 will be impacted less. In summary, for XPU connected devices, the challenges to the QMS include standards and training. Making sure you have the right standards and training. And safe for intended use, the risk management process is going to be impacted. Clearly, you're going to have cybersecurity. That's going to be an issue. Could be an issue. You have to address that. Data analysis, validation, and clinical and risk are going to be important to that. Supplier controls, you use supply controls, you have to make sure that that those are in control. Your auditing program, make sure that they have the recognition that there are new standards are going to be used, that they have the right appropriate training. Those type of things are going to be done. You could get also impacted and challenge in the pre-market, getting permission to sell a device in the market, especially if it's a novel device. The route that you take could be different. Could be a de novo, or could be a 510K. Most likely might be a PMA. Those are things that you have to worry. That's why you have to have a regulatory strategy. This concludes the overall fundamental look at the quality management system and some of the processes and regulations that changed. If you have any questions, I will be available at the question and answer session, whenever that is, at the end of the symposium, I believe. Thank you for participating.